Welcome to Slow Night Ancient Tales. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of 1930s Korea with a poignant, unfinished masterpiece by the renowned author Kim Yu-jeong, titled Life's Companion. It is a melancholic exploration of a young man's descent into obsession, the heavy burden of a broken family, and a desperate search for solace in a harsh world. Close your eyes, let the quiet of the night settle in, and let us wander into their story. Life's Companion, author unfinished. Source Jong-ang. It might not be right to write a story about a friend, but I have acquired a motive that compels me to begin this tale. Because if any misfortune has befallen Myung-ryol, I cannot help but bear a great responsibility. Currently, he is completely ruined. And I am, in a way, the one who assisted in his ruin, an accomplice, so to speak. Even so, this will not simply be my excuse. I also hope that it will become a true record of life for my beloved friend, Myung-ryol. It was exactly the 27th of April. The reason I visited Myung-ryol in the middle of the night was, well, there wasn't really a reason, but I just wanted to see him briefly. His house was also in Sajik-dong, barely 50 away from mine. Despite that, he rarely came to visit me. Of course, it's not that I haven't complained and grumbled about it, but upon further reflection, I decided to let it go. The reason was that he was a peculiar young man who extremely loathed interacting with people. If deviating from the norm is called an illness, then this too must ultimately be a kind of grave illness. That is why I often went to visit him like this. Pushing the room door open and stepping in, I saw him crouched in front of the desk in the corner of the room, still with his shaggy hair. He surely knew it was me, but he never once turned his head to look. Plopping down on the floor, I struck up a conversation. "What are you studying?" He didn't answer, just kept fiddling with the English dictionary on his desk. His demeanor suggested he wasn't reading the words, nor was he completely ignoring them. He was just flipping from page to page with a hazy gaze. Seeing this, it was clear he was deeply immersed in some thought. "If someone says something to you, give a reply," I spoke bluntly. But it wasn't as if I didn't know what he was thinking about at that moment. After lighting a cigarette, I exhaled the smoke and muttered to myself, "Did you write a letter again today?" Only then did he seem to come to his senses. He turned his head toward me and looked at me for a long time, saying, "I've been waiting for you to come." Then he said, "I have a favor to ask of you," and brought his gaze back to the English dictionary. It seemed he was unsure whether I would grant his request or not, so he wanted to hear my disposition first before revealing his inner thoughts. I readily accepted. "What kind of favor? If it's possible, I'll do it." "Thank you." Then, he suddenly grew animated, opened his desk drawer and took out a tightly sealed letter in an envelope, written who knows when, and placed it before me. Then, in an excited, stammering voice, he almost pleaded, "Please, deliver this letter for me, right now." He rushed as if some great disaster would occur if this letter wasn't delivered immediately. Listening to him, he acknowledged that it was of course unreasonable to ask a friend for such a favor, but added that this might be the last time he asks such a thing of me, so he begged me to treat it with importance and to sincerely do my best. And at the very end, "And make sure you get a reply and bring it back," he emphasized the request he had been making earlier. All right. I gave a willing consent in a single word and went out to the street. However, this was not an action born of my own free will, nor had I even thought about how I should handle this letter. It was a friend's earnest plea, so I simply took it and left reluctantly. Making my way down the night streets, crowded because it was the season for night cherry blossoms, I was bewildered, unsure if I should actually deliver this letter or not. It was a place where even a carefully sent express mail would return with a "delivery refused" tag. There was no reason they would blink an eye and accept it just because I delivered it by hand. I didn't even think to put the letter in my pocket. I just held it awkward, Deli in one hand, looking at it over and over with a dubious gaze. This might have been my big mistake. Thinking about why I didn't flat out refuse from the start leaves me with lasting regret. But on second thought, there seemed to be another reason why I walked out with this letter without a word of complaint. It wasn't merely because it was a friend's request. If so, I was definitely intimidated by the bizarrely serious expression Myung-ryol had when he handed it to me. Due to a long lack of sunlight, his face was sallow and puffy, and around his untouched mouth, dark facial hair jutted out wildly, making it hard to believe he was 23. His cheeks, which should naturally be vibrant, were sunken, and his eyes were deeply hollowed from consecutive nights of staying awake. In short, he resembled a beast more than a person confined in a cage. On top of that, he had asked me to deliver this letter with tears in his eyes and in a tone trembling with excessive tension. Seeing this, one would know how crucial this letter was. If this letter failed to be delivered properly, Myung-ryol would surely not stay sane. Anyway, I arrived at the place where I had to bring it. Where I stopped was a back alley in Donui-dong. Right in front of me was a gate with an electric light hanging over it, and next to it, on a marble stone, hung a nameplate reading Namyeongju. Laughter and occasional songs flowed from inside, but the gate was firmly shut. My mission was to offer the letter to this house and receive a reply. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't muster the courage to step up and knock on the gate. It wasn't as if she would gladly accept the letter. After all, what did she care? But considering the unpredictability of human affairs, and the fact that I had come all this way as a messenger, I thought perhaps she might accept it out of mere curiosity. Thinking, let's just politely offer it, I stepped closer to the gate. However, even if she did accept it, what if she impudently ripped it open, skimmed through it, and tossed it aside? What would my situation be then? No, rather than me, Myung-ryol, who put his whole heart into writing it, would suffer the primary insult. No matter what, I didn't want my friend to be humiliated, so I stepped back away from the gate again. After repeating this 3 or 4 times, I made a firm decision. I put the letter in my pocket and headed straight back up toward Sajikdong. Just as I was about to enter Myung-ryol's house, suddenly, from behind me, "Hey!" someone called. Looking back, there he was, standing on the opposite hill in his grass-green trousers. He seemed to have been waiting there, anticipating I would come back that way. He took me up to Sajik Park and quietly asked, "Did you deliver it?" "Yeah," I mumbled an answer through my nose, but realizing that was insufficient, I clearly answered, "I delivered it well." Did she receive it well? Why wouldn't they accept someone bringing a letter? I bluffed loudly, but when he immediately followed up with, "Then what about the reply?" I couldn't help but be flustered. I hadn't thought that far ahead. After hesitating a little, I mumbled, "I didn't get a reply," but feeling that wasn't enough, I added, "When I got there, Myungju was out at a party, so waiting for her would mean waiting until 2 or 4 in the morning. So I met the live-in maid and earnestly asked her to give it to her lady as soon as she returns." I thoroughly explained the reason I couldn't bring the reply back. However, he seemed somewhat satisfied just by the fact that I had left the letter at the house. He tightly grasped my right hand with both of his hands and said, "Thank you," expressing his gratitude. At that moment, I saw something glistening in the moonlight above his eyes. I felt a pang in my chest, feeling more deeply apologetic and guilty towards him than worried about the sin of telling such a lie. I cheerfully patted his back and said, "Don't be so impatient. How can you expect things to happen as easily as eating a meal? If she's human, she'll reply someday." "A reply?" He lifted his bowed head and said, "She won't reply as things stand." "What do you mean, as things stand? Don't worry, I'll go and get it directly myself anytime." I'm someone who often acts rashly and suffers for it, yet I blurted out this senseless bravado. On my part, I surely wanted to give him a moment of joy, but of course, I didn't think about what the consequences would be. So for him, it was no surprise that he placed his hopes in my guarantee and asked again, "Then, I'm sorry, but could you deliver a letter one more time? And this time, be sure to get a reply." Thus, starting from a lie, an absurd situation began to unfold. Of course, I must take full responsibility for it, but if you look closely, Myung-ryol must also bear a part. Because as I mentioned before, he was not a person of ordinary temperament. At first glance, one might think that what he was doing by writing these letters was a romance. Since the other party was a woman, and he stayed up night after night writing letters, everyone would undoubtedly conclude it was love. However, this was certainly not the romance people usually speak of. That kind of romance seeks fragrance and beauty from the other party. In other words, it is a state of desiring the other person exactly as they are. But his romance was an almost maddening attempt to find himself within the other person. Of course, not even a shadow of himself was reflected in her. Therefore, as I will explain later, he even reached a sophistry where he would use violence to confront the other party and demand himself. Therefore, it would be appropriate to say that this was by no means romance. Firstly, his letters were not love letters. Generally, love letters beautifully embellish the recipient. His letters, however, picked apart and exposed every ugly part of the other person. You could say mostly it was curses. Therefore, not only did the other party not reply, but sometimes they even refused to receive them. Secondly, the recipient was a person in the red light district. Despite that, she was 5 years older than Myung-ryol. Approaching 30, as a gisang, she was past her prime and fading. Moreover, her appearance was not outstanding or noticeably striking in any way. She was the kind of person an energetic 20-something would find completely devoid of charm. So why was Myung-ryol drawn to such a woman? I will refrain from explaining that here. First, let's hear Myung-ryol's account. The first time he saw Myung-ju was last autumn. He even memorized the exact time, around 1 p.m. near Suendong. When he was returning from Bonggikdong on a family errand, there was a woman coming out of a public bathhouse holding a small wash basin. Her unmade face was deathly pale, and her body was extremely emaciated, as if she suffered from some illness. Her eyes were full of sorrow, yet with an expressionless face, she stared at the distant sky. Holding her white jogori and white chima tightly to her chest, she was walking slowly, carefully, as if afraid the ground would cave in beneath her. She looked like someone who had been battered by the world's hardships several times over, and consequently had lost all interest in living. Without realizing it, Myung-ryol followed her. Coming all the way to her house and watching her casually toss the basin inside, he stood there staring blankly for a long time, as if he had lost his soul. And upon returning home, he began writing letters from that very night. He sent one every day, but there was never a reply. Even after 10 days, even after more than 15 days, still no reply. The more this happened, the more anxious he grew, and the more feverishly he sent letters. He wasted all his nights writing letters, and during the day he would pull his blanket over himself in his gloomy room and wait for the sun to set. Since he stayed up all night, he would sometimes pass out, but mostly he just lay in bed with his eyes closed, waiting for the next night. While he occasionally had such habits when his mind wandered in the past, this was the first time it had persisted for so long. Thinking about it now, a person probably feels the truest love when they are most deeply sorrowful. Lately, Myung-ryol was walking on the precipice of despair in life, and consequently, the peak of melancholy. If you turn his environment inside out, his unusual behavior wouldn't be impossible to understand, but I will push the discussion of that to a later time. Whenever I occasionally went to check on him, he was undoubtedly a madman. Aside from his loathing of sunlight, his roughened face and cloudy eyes, anyone who saw him would say he was a psychiatric patient. On top of that, the room itself was depressing. There was one window facing south, but it was covered with a black curtain completely blocking out the sunlight, and the room was dense with cigarette smoke. Every time I faced him, I couldn't help but feel an ominous premonition. It felt as if a massive block of iron was aimed at him, slowly, gradually descending. I thought that sooner or later he wouldn't be able to stay the way he was. One day, making a firm resolve, I went to see Myung-ju. No matter how I thought about it, this wench was not human. If she had received that many letters from him, even if she didn't want to write, she ought to have written at least one reply. How arrogant must she be to just gobble up the letters blindly? I wanted to go right then and uncover the reason. And if possible, I wanted to get a reply and bring it to him. It was dark, but still early evening. Even so, the gate was firmly shut. Pounding the door with my fist, I shouted in a booming voice, "Is anybody there?" Though my appearance might be shabby coming to a gisang house, there was no need to lower my voice. Again, loudly, but trying not to lose dignity, I yelled, "Open the gate!" Only then was there some movement inside, and the door opened. A woman who looked to be in her 30s poked her head out, scanned me from top to bottom, and asked, "Who are you looking for?" Judging by her husky voice, she seemed to be the live-in maid. At a time like this, if I had casually asked, "Is Myung-ju here?" it might have worked. But being naive and completely ignorant of the etiquette of a gisang house, I said, I came to see Miss Na Myung-ju." She frowned needlessly and replied, "She went out to work," in a dismissive tone. And before I could even finish asking, a useless question anyway, "Where did she go?" she slammed the door shut and snapped, "I don't know." In such a situation, one should just laugh it off, but I was genuinely irritated. I thought about smashing the door in, but ultimately decided I would rather die than come back to a gisang house, and turned around. I immediately went straight to Myung-ryol's house. In a fit of anger, I explained everything in detail and complained, "I suffered humiliation because of you." To be fair, he never told me to go, but, I continued, the ones in gisang houses aren't even human. If they had even an ounce of humanity, they wouldn't ignore letters for half a month without a single reply. Over there, they don't even treat you like a human being. Think about it. What are you that a gisang would treat you with extreme care? In this country, there are plenty of wealthy people with money and honor besides you. Gisang are the property of such men. They are certainly not beings born to be loved by you. I explained this to him in detail, adding, "Just look at the way that wench treated me earlier. If I had walked in draped in expensive silk, the whole house would have boiled over, clamoring for me to come in. Are these things human?" I poured out these harsh words, and he made a bitter face. "She probably said she wasn't there because she really wasn't. Surely she wouldn't just brush you off." "What do you mean, really wasn't?" I screamed at him. And again, a gisang is just a gisang. If she were young, maybe, but she's an old woman approaching 30. What do you see in her that your mind is so consumed? I made it clear once more that this was the kind of foolishness only a mental patient would engage in, and said, "Stop writing the letters starting today. With so many girls out there, why bother with someone like that?" "You don't know what you're talking about," he interrupted, seemingly unwilling to hear any more. "I'd rather be in love with a corpse," he retorted bluntly. Infuriated, I roared, "I don't want to hear it." The eyes glaring at me instantly became bloodshot red. I knew that no matter how much more I advised him, he wouldn't listen. I considered it fortunate that we didn't end up in a physical altercation and just left. Since things turned out this way, the next time I went to deliver a letter and came back lying without even having knocked on the gate, it surely wasn't entirely my fault alone. But I didn't blame him. In his mind, he possessed his own separate woman. There was a woman he deeply respected. He pulled that woman out into the world and began to adore her. And Myung-ju had simply coincidentally become the model for that woman. I came to know Myung-ryol during our high school days. Compared to others his age, he was a mature student. He was exceptionally tall with a broad face. He stuttered slightly when speaking normally, but when he had to read a book aloud in front of the teacher, he stuttered severely. Back then, we nicknamed him Stutterer. In return, he was a student of few words. Sometimes we even thought of him as cowardly. That was because he avoided places where many people gathered, sneaking away quietly. When no one was around, he would go down to the schoolyard and do pull-ups or floor gymnastics. But during lunch break, when the entire school poured out to play, he would wander alone on the lawn. Of course, whenever there was a school picnic or a field trip, he tried to skip it using any excuse he could find. He was a peculiar boy who feared people. Moreover, his grades were poor every day. Especially by the 4th or 5th grade, his grades were so bad that he was practically failing his courses. To borrow the teacher's words, he believed in his own talent and didn't study. But believing in one's own talent is something said about a person who at least gives some thought to their studies. Not only did he have no interest in his subjects, but he also hadn't developed any affection for the school itself. As proof, looking at his attendance record for 1 year, the number of days he attended school was less than 2/3. The homeroom teacher would get angry, saying he had never seen a student like this, and shoving the attendance book under his nose. "Here, look with your own eyes." Is this the attendance book of a bastard who goes to school? Myung-ryul would just stand there dumbly, his face turning red. There was something he told me once at Namsan Mountain. That day, because he was making a fuss about skipping, I was absent too. We went up Namsan and lay on the grass, using our book bundles as pillows. We were chatting about this and that, when at the end of some topic he asked, "How does one become a Manchurian bandit?" "Why do you want to be a Manchurian bandit?" "No, I mean, you just become one, I guess. Couldn't you at least become a bandit like that?" "What do you mean, a bandit like that?" He opened his eyes wide in denial and then said, "You're taking being a bandit too lightly. It's not something an ordinary person can just do. Eating boldly, working boldly, isn't that nice? I wouldn't go even if they begged me." "Did someone say they would beg you? If they don't bring people in, wouldn't they all die out? That's why they put out recruitment ads when they need new me." "Embers," he said, rummaging through his suit jacket pocket, and handed me a palm-sized newspaper clipping. "Here, look." I took it and read it. It was an article about 3 middle schoolers from across the sea who saw a recruitment ad for a Manchurian bandit gang and were caught near Sinuiju while heading to Manchuria. After reading it, I handed it back and snorted, "Humph, you think you can become a bandit with that?" I remember hearing him talk about Manchurian bandits 3 or 4 times after that. Seeing this, it seems he truly wanted to become one. I called him eccentric, but looking back on it now, it seems like a natural thing. He lost both his parents when he was young, and he was a boy who grew up wandering on his own, eating food while constantly reading others' faces. If so, perhaps his misanthropy also took root here. He had one older brother. He was a debauchee who drowned in wine and women, oblivious to day and night, and he was an ignorant tyrant who demanded that his 10 family members sacrifice themselves for his own well-being. He had no refinement and no knowledge, but he had hundreds of thousands of wealth laid out before him, which only fueled his violent behavior. A massive inheritance left by parents easily breeds misfortune. This is even more true for a young man in his mid-20s with no willpower or convictions. He was no exception to this rule. He would go a month, or even 2 months, fasting from food and drinking alcohol day and night. He brought jisangs into the house and committed lewd acts openly in front of his family. He caused turmoil by bringing 2 or 3 concubines to live under the same roof. It wasn't that he lacked the money to do so, but managing a household or taking care of business was too much of a bother for him. He exclusively drank alcohol and lay with women. He cared for nothing else, let alone family matters. Even if his family fell ill and lay in bed, he wouldn't provide a single dose of medicine, and even if the children had no shoes, he wouldn't willingly buy them a pair. At first, he drank for the fun of getting loud and drunk with various friends. However, after doing this so many times, that alone wasn't entertaining enough. He gradually began to show drunken violence. He would perform one drunken antic several times, and when he grew bored, he would try another, and when he tired of that, on to the next. His demand for increasingly intense stimulation had no end. When he drank, he smashed the household belongings and took an axe to the pillars. Then he would catch the family members one by one and assault them. He would grab a woman by her hairpin, step on the back of her neck with both feet, and pull her hair out. Or he would grab a kitchen knife and chase family members fleeing to the street barefoot, threatening to kill them. He caused a commotion by throwing a nursing infant into the yard. Or he threw a child into a well, who then had to be taken to the hospital unconscious. Thus, the household flowed with screams and blood almost every day. After hitting his family until he grew bored, he would sometimes bite into his own arm until it bled. Out of 12 months in a year, this would continue for a whole month at a time. When the head of the family came home drunk, the family members' faces would turn ashen and they would tremble. Not only because they didn't know when they might die by his hands, but primarily because the pain was unbearable. They were essentially toys born merely to receive the drunken abuse of this cruel and atrocious drunkard. And in that household, there was no warm affection, no hobbies, no loyalty, nothing at all. There was only alcohol, debauchery, and screams. Myung-ryul grew up his childhood in such a family. He frequently had no choice but to hide his body in the hole under the wooden floor, his teeth chattering, his chest tightening, and inwardly he would lament, "When will that bastard die so I don't have to get beta?" A distant relative came, saw this, and felt pity. Thinking that under these conditions, let alone studying, even surviving would be impossible, they advised, "Give Myung-ryol his share of the inheritance, so he can go somewhere else and study separately. How can he live like this?" Upon hearing this, the brother replied, "Don't worry, I will take care of it myself," and brushed it off. Then, after drinking heavily with that relative, he ended up striking the relative who suggested the division of property with a wooden pillow, breaking 2 of his teeth. Myung-ryol rightfully had the right to receive his share of the property from his older brother. Therefore, the excessively greedy brother would flip his lid and jump in anger at the mere mention of property division. Giving a young person their share ruins them. What if you turn out like me? Huh? After you finish all your studies, I'll set you up with your own household later on. This was his excuse for not dividing the property. However, that vast fortune dwindled away in less than 17 years. By the time the brother, who had been living in Seoul, dumped Myung-ryol onto his older sister and moved down to the countryside, there were only a few hundred sok of land left. As Myung-ryol gradually grew up, he became a bothersome presence to his brother. Giving him sweet talk, he abandoned him in Seoul, and only his own family moved back to their ancestral hometown in the countryside. This happened around the time Myung-ryol graduated from high school and wanted to go to Tokyo, but couldn't because his family didn't approve, leaving him hesitating and idling about. Raised under his brother's thumb without ever being able to spread his wings, he was handed over to his sister. Accordingly, feeling as if he had finally found a way to live, he couldn't help but be happy. But that sister was also a different person from his expectations. She was still a young widow of 32. She had married at 14 and lived with her husband's family for over 10 years before being chased out. There is nothing more unfortunate than a young bride returning to a wealthy maiden home, which is to say, there were countless petty excuses to torment her. With subtle accusations that she couldn't even manage to buy a piece of thread while letting money rot, she had been chased back. But even when she returned to her maiden home, there was no one to welcome her. The so-called head of the family, her older brother, beat her almost every day. Not only that, but he ultimately kicked her out onto the streets with her head busted open, claiming a married woman was eating the family's food. Wandering alone after enduring such storms, what she barely managed to get was a job. And renting a single room, she started living alone on that salary. Of course, she had no children. It was a year after they lived in that cramped room that the siblings moved to this house. The brother who went to the countryside to shut his younger brother's mouth rented a small house with 2 rooms at the top of Sajikdong. This was the house. And for their living expenses, there was only the sister's salary. The sister was a factory worker in the tailoring department of the police affairs division. She would go around 6 a.m. and leave around 5 p.m. Her daily wage was about 70 jeon, so a month's pay, excluding holidays, came to a little over 19 won. With that, the 2 of them ate and lived. However, for a frail young woman, factory life was an unbearably hard labor. Not even 5 years into working at the factory, she completely changed. Her eyes became vacant, and her body dried up. And if a normal person saw her, they would instantly think, "Is that person crazy?" So bizarre were her words and actions. She was clearly someone who was quick-tempered and whose moods changed like boiling porridge. Coupled with the hysteria she developed from the factory, she reached a point where she couldn't control her own temper. There will be more to say about that later, but for now, it is enough to know that she was not a healthy person. During the day, while working at the factory, there were times she would doze off. Then, if she made a wrong move, she would prick her thumb with the sewing machine needle, but unable to cry out, she would just stand there at a loss. Then the supervisor would come, slap her on the back of the head, and glare at her. "That's because you were dozing." Or sometimes she would be late coming back from the restroom. The supervisor would find it suspicious and rush over. Flinging the door open, he would hit her on the head with a ruler and yell, Are you counting puppies in here? But she had to suppress the surging sorrow and anger. Talking back to the supervisor meant quitting the factory. Also, since she worked among men, she suffered not a little from issues involving relations between men and women. There were scoundrels who would casually grope her, and scoundrels who would glare at her, or scoundrels who mocked her and picked fights. Even so, she couldn't fight with men at the factory, so she had no other choice but to endure it. She bottled up the rage of being despised, only to explode once she barely made it home. This was because there was an easy target, her docile younger brother, waiting there. Coming home, she would smash the dishes she had painstakingly bought herself. Then, turning to her brother, she would open her eyes wide and say, "Why do I feed you?" Sometimes she would say, "What are you that I have to suffer like this?" Or stomp her feet, shouting viciously, "You bastard! Go ahead and scrape off my flesh and eat it." Then she would flop down and cry out loud, wailing bitterly. Of course, this sorrow was not directed at her brother. However, when the brother heard these words, not only did he feel apologetic, but chills would run down his spine. Day after day, the sister tormented her brother. She tormented him as if it were a given, without any fault on his part. And after doing so, she would let out a long sigh, phew, and calm her mind. So to speak plainly, the brother was nothing more than a laborer who ate her food and was used as an outlet for her anger. But the sister was not actually an evil woman. Feeling her future was empty, she had taken in a young girl from the countryside as an adopted daughter and was raising her. She certainly couldn't have been doing this because she hated having her brother around. Even at the time when her brother moved in, she was incredibly delighted. Even on a late winter night, she personally came, carrying his books, desk, and bedding on her head, constantly reminding him, "Don't forget these things. Remember the sorrow you suffered under our older brother, study hard, and become a great man." Or, "That inheritance, don't take it even if he gives it to you. It's dirty." She pleaded with him several times in a tearful voice to help him forge a firm resolve. In her own way, she felt terribly sorry for her brother, who grew up without parents. Following behind her on the icy road, the brother too would let out a deep sigh, overwhelmed with emotion. But less than 5 days later, the symptoms of that illness began to appear. This was the outline of the environment Myung-ryol had lived in up to this point. One might suspect then, did he have no will to live? But he too had a conviction and the effort that followed it. First of all, as evidence, he sought out the Gisang Myung-ju, and having a terrifying motive to put his sister to sleep forever was also a result of the effort he was making to find a way to survive, as we will gradually learn. If we were to probe his depression, the causes of the illness likely branched out in many directions, but the fundamental underlying disease was that he starved for affection. In other words, he starved for people. Occasionally he would cry out to me out of nowhere, "I want to see my mother." It is perhaps no surprise that he came to think of an older Gisang. He probably saw many things in her, namely, he needed Myungju as a mother, as a friend, and as a lover. But at that time, I lacked the capacity to understand even that much. Since she was a Gisang who hardly seemed human, I only hoped for his own sake that he would give her up a day sooner. It was the 3rd day since I had told that lie. While I was eating dinner, I heard a familiar voice say, "Is Uncle here?" I quickly opened the sliding door and looked out. It was undoubtedly Myung-ryol's adopted niece. "Why?" My uncle said to give this to you." And she handed me a small, folded piece of paper. Taking it and unfolding it, it read simply, "Could you come over for a bit?" That was the message. Since I was just about to clear the dining table, I changed my clothes, and I slowly followed the girl. "What's your uncle doing right now?" "He's always sick and moaning," Sione said with a pitiful expression. However, I felt somewhat uneasy, because I could roughly guess the reason why he called for me. When I entered, his sister was brewing medicine. It was a cramped house, with the wall and the outhouse right next to each other. The drain was open. The yard was barely a pyong and a half, a tiny space between the wooden porch and the sauce jars. On the edge of that palm-sized yard, white rice grains were scattered here and there. Seeing this, it seemed her illness had passed through again today. She might have thrown it all out while trying to make dinner. Seeing me, she made an unpleasant face and said, "He's sick." With an anxious heart, I asked, "I wonder what kind of illness it is. Maybe it's just fatigue?" She replied, "I don't know what illness it is," and then, "He doesn't eat a single thing and just moans day and night. Maybe I—" She brought the edge of her apron to her eyes before she could even finish her sentence. Then, after sniffing a few times, she complained, "Maybe he got sick to protest against me scolding him." Of course, she was an extremely docile woman once a bout of her illness had passed. She seemed to think her brother had fallen ill because she had tormented him. With comforting words, I said, "Don't worry, he probably just caught a spring fever," and went into the opposite room. He was lying still under the blanket. He had eagerly called for me, but of course, he didn't even greet me. He just stared a hole into the ceiling with half-closed eyes and kept his mouth shut. His pale face and hollow eyes looked even worse than a few days ago. Blue veins bulged prominently on the back of his pale hands, and his face showed a pained expression, wrapped in heavy melancholy. At first glance, I knew he had another illness besides his usual habit. After watching him for a while, I asked, "Where does it hurt?" He seemed to open his mouth to give some answer, but then just smacked his lips. He appeared to be in immense physical pain. He just kept grimacing and staring at the ceiling. Once again, in a loud voice, I asked, "Where does it hurt?" He muttered an answer in his mouth, then asked, "Where are you going?" "My back is a bit stiff." He finally brought his gaze to me, but it was likely not true that his back was stiff. Wondering why his back would be stiff, I casually suggested, "Then go to the hospital. You have to treat an illness early on." He gave no answer to this. He just scowled again and groaned. Thinking back on it now, he might have pitied my dullness. He poured the medicine his sister had strained and brought into the chamber pot, and then he just shoved the empty bowl to the upper part of the floor. It was as if accepting and taking that medicine would be a great insult. Had the sister witnessed this, there would have been another uproar. Since it happened after she left the room, it passed without incident. Seeing this, it was clear that even from this point, he harbored a deep resentment toward his sister. After a while, he turned to me and asked quietly, "I'm sorry, but could you go one more time?" Where I was supposed to go was obvious without asking. "All right," I agreed readily. Then he slipped his hand under the mattress, pulled out a letter, and pushed it forward. "Make sure you get a reply." "All right." Without a second word, I took the letter and left. I also felt sorry about the promise I made the other day to bring back a reply. I resolved that today, no matter what happened, I would get a reply. This was the third time I was going there. Once I was humiliated by the live-in maid, and another time I went to deliver the letter but came back without even knocking on the gate. I had never once met the person in question. If a person goes and begs, there's no way she won't write a single reply. Thinking this, I was walking down toward Jongno when, "Hey, how long has it been?" "Wow, it's really been a while." I bumped into Park In-sok. He was a high school classmate of ours. Now he had finished his law studies at Basong College and was running a pawn shop. As I was about to wrap up our greetings and part ways, he said, "Hey man, I have something to discuss with you," and headed to the tea house next door. Just because he had a few pennies, his patronizing way of saying, "Hey man, look here," was a bit nauseating. But since he said he had something to discuss, I asked what kind of discussion it was. He ostentatiously ordered 2 black teas and asked me, "What are you doing these days?" "What is there to do? I play day and night." "What are you going to do if you just play like that?" He opened his eyes wide as if it were a big deal. Wondering what kind of nonsense this was, I replied, "Then what should I do if I don't play?" He then quite seriously lectured me. "A person should work. You shouldn't just play." I felt insulted, but held it in and drank my tea. He also drank his tea a few times, then pulled a watch out of his pocket. A yellow watch on a yellow chain that looked recently bought. "Huh, it's late. If it weren't late, I would have taken you to the theater," he boasted. The truth was, he didn't want to go to the theater. He just wanted to show off his newly bought watch. "Don't you want to get a job?" "Doing what?" I asked, looking up at him. "It's nothing like that. It's about my son. I sent him to kindergarten, but the brat completely refuses to go. He grew up spoiled and can't leave his mother's arms, so I want you to come and play with him, act as a home tutor, so to speak." After subtly scanning my reaction, he asked, "What do you say?" Asking a friend to play with his kid made little sense. "Frivolous bastard," I fumed inwardly, but I readily accepted, saying, "Sure, thanks." Because a sudden thought had occurred to me. This guy had frequented Jisang houses since our high school days. His experience with Jisang houses would undoubtedly be much clearer than mine, who was illiterate in that area. Then wouldn't it be easier to get the reply by using this guy Park as a middleman? Thinking this, I asked, "Park, do you still go to Jisang houses often these days?" "Why do you ask?" "No, just wondering. Sometimes, when I hang out with friends, I go." "Are there people who actually love Jisangs?" "What kind of talk is that? If a Jisang, who lives off love, has no love, how can she live?" "So I guess they'd be busy writing reply letters then." "Reply letters?" He glared at me as if I was speaking nonsense and added, "If you want a Jisang, you pay her entertainment fee, call her out to a restaurant, and have fun playing the instruments. That's how it is. Why would anyone write those useless replies?" And lest I still didn't understand, he firmly clarified, "What kind of Jisang goes out there to write reply letters?" Thinking about it quietly, I realized he was probably right. It was no different from the thoughts I had the other day. "Let's meet again next time." I bid a simple farewell and came out onto the street. No matter how I thought about it, this letter would never receive a reply. You can't force someone to write a reply they don't want to write. And expecting a reply to a letter they even avoid receiving is a bit of an excessive desire. I realized the only way to meet a Gisang is to call her out to a restaurant. Hesitating on what to do, I hatched a plan and went straight back home. I went into my room and took out the letter from my pocket, and feeling that it was rude, I still tore the letter open and read it. "To Miss Nam Youngju, I hope you have been in good health these past days. I'm extremely sorry for repeatedly sending letters that remain unanswered. I humbly ask for your full forgiveness. Miss, I have a question for you. Do you have joy? And can you laugh cheerfully and brightly? If you say you can, then try giving a hearty laugh in front of a mirror. The face reflected in it will be a wretched figure that certainly does not match your cheerful laughter. How ugly and vicious a sight would that be? Miss, however, you may fortunately be able to laugh, because your miserable visage is covered in powder and fine silk hides your foul flesh. Do not be offended by my disrespect in calling your precious body flesh. Your body is a cumbersome lump of foul flesh that cannot be eaten, and this body of mine is also a lump of foul flesh that cannot be eaten. Miss, do you know yourself? If so, you are extremely happy. I am a fool who does not know himself, a lost traveler in an empty wilderness. Miss, if I have one single wish right now, it is that I want to see the mother I lost when I was young, and I want to be held in her arms and cry to my heart's content until my energy is exhausted. But she is no longer in this world, so what can I do? Miss, do you know sorrow? If you do, please share a piece of it with me, and point me to the path that follows it." The letter was simply signed at the end with this. Although the text was different, the content was generally the same as the letter I had delivered last time. Would the contents of this letter get through to a Jisang? I doubted it. And so I called my younger sister, who was attending a girls' high school, and had her write down what I dictated. To Mr. Yu Myung-ryol, in reply, "I wonder if you have been well, and I am infinitely grateful for the letters you have continuously sent over the past 10 months. However, as my lowly body has fallen into the red light district, I have no way of understanding your intent, and so I have been unable to reply. My heart feels immeasurably stifled because of this. Furthermore, for a gentleman of your promising future to write such letters to a Gisang is a great tragedy, so I earnestly and sincerely ask that you stop immediately. I wish you continuous health, and I will end here. On the last day of April, from Nam Youngju." Such a reply in a woman's handwriting. With this much, he wouldn't doubt it at all. Of course, at that time, I was too pressed by the immediate situation to even think about the consequences of this letter. I took it to him without hesitation to give him joy. We cannot imagine how great a joy this reply gave him. His heart fluttered so much that he couldn't immediately tear the letter open upon receiving it. He set it down on the floor, closed his eyes for a long time, and calmed his excitement. Only after that did he finally pick it up with both hands and tear it open. After reading it all, in a suppressed voice, he said, "Thank you." It wasn't that my conscience wasn't pricked. But seeing his joy was also a joy to me, so I smoothly accepted. Don't mention it. What's there to be thankful for? Thus I began to commit my offense. At least twice a week I had no choice but to read his letters, and even if I didn't want to, I inevitably had to write the replies. The impact this had on him was quite significant. The more letters went back and forth, the more he revered Myungju. In the end, it moved beyond the feeling of romance and entirely idolized her. So to speak, this was not a woman, but a religion forged for the path he was to take, and the sorrow that followed was the tangled reality surrounding him. He endlessly cursed his circumstances. Not only that, he also endlessly cursed his sister. His sister was lending money at interest back then. Of course, from that meager salary of 19 won, she would set aside 5 won or 10 won to lend out. She usually lent it to factory workers on a monthly installment plan, so the remainder wasn't enough for a month's living expenses. As a result, she bought cheap millet, drew water with her own hands, and so on. Sometimes, pushing her exhausted body, she even stayed up all night doing sewing work for others. Consequently, her already ailing body grew more emaciated by the day. She was a relentlessly tenacious woman like this. However, the money she lent didn't come back as easily as she wished. When it was time to pay, they would give this excuse and that excuse and just gloss over it. Even worse, some would say, "I'll pay it back properly next time. Please give me a little more money." Where would the money go if it's there and here, coaxing her? Or some rough men would assertively threaten, "If you don't lend me more money, I won't pay the old debt either." It was a factory rule that money lending was not allowed inside. She couldn't openly fight over it, and moreover, being very capricious, she easily fell for others' sweet talk. She would be firmly demanding payment a few times, but then suddenly succumb and end up sending them more money on top of the uncollected debt. With her hasty temper, whether she got the money back later or not wasn't really the issue. Primarily, she only needed the thought that this money would go out, multiply, and turn into a great fortune. Thus, she acted recklessly, flailing about without foresight. It was understandable, as she had been abused by her in-laws over money, and she had been kicked out of her maiden home over food. Consider how much hardship she had endured over years of factory life. The desire to quickly make a fortune and live comfortably was overwhelming. Sometimes she would sigh. Someone played the money-lending game with 200 won, and in less than 2 years, bought a 3,000 won house. And at night, she occasionally pulled out the large pouch strapped under her skirt. She would pour out the money from it and carefully count it, looking as affectionate as could be. Only when she calculated what she spent and found not a single penny missing would she finally let out a sigh of relief and sleep. Then one day, the money went missing. It was when she came out of the factory and was making dinner. She had gone out herself, bought meat and green onions, and brought them in. She was happily putting soy sauce paste on the brazier. Of course, the illness had passed, but also, for the first time in a long while, she had received 5 won from the money she had lent out. While easily serving rice, she suddenly screeched, "Who took the money here?" She had suddenly seen the money resting on the kitchen doorframe. Out of 10 jeon, she bought 5 jeon of meat, 1 jeon of green onions, and 1 jeon of matches, so there should surely be 3 jeon left, but there was only 2 jeon. She immediately called Sony and asked, "What did you do with the 1 jeon here?" "I don't know," Sony said, her eyes wide with bewilderment. "You bitch, you don't know?" And she started beating her. The truth was, she had completely forgotten she gave 1 jeon to the soybean curd seller earlier. She was absent-minded like this, and suffered from forgetfulness, even forgetting her own absent-mindedness. She beat the girl for a good while, demanding she tell the truth, and only after busting her head open with a stick of firewood did she finally realize her miscalculation. Putting medicine on the busted head, she feigned a stern face, saying, "Don't do that habit of stealing again in the future." However, inwardly, it wasn't as if she had no shameful conscience. In times like this, she would feel less apologetic if her brother came out and said a few words about her zeal, but she hated him for always being as silent as a mute who ate honey while eating her food. She didn't give rice to her brother. She brought only her and Seoni's portions to the wooden porch, and they ate affectionately together. Then, facing the closed door of the opposite room, she started up again. Let's see him starve for a bit. A person only comes to their senses when their stomach growls. Of course, there was no reply from the opposite room. After a short pause, she started again. You went to school so well, finishing high school, only to leech off others' food. Or, she sneered sharply, why do I have to feed the one our older brother should be feeding? My fate is so harsh. I have to see all sorts of pathetic sights. It wasn't that she yelled in a loud voice. She plucked at him subtly with a soft yet thorny tone. Haven't you leeched off enough? Hurry up and scrape my bones and eat them too. And sons are dog sons, she would subtly scratch at him. She never tormented her brother with physical force. Subtly targeting and scratching his nerves to make him uneasy was much more effective in torturing him. If she used force, the brother's expression would be dull. But when she scratched his temper like this, his face would turn pale and he would tremble both fists as if ready to pounce on her. Yet, he still couldn't dare to attack his sister. The sister thoroughly enjoyed this peculiar expression, and only after that would she calm her rough feelings of anger, dissatisfaction, and sorrow. That was how twisted a nature this woman possessed. In this aspect, Myung-ryol despised his sister immensely. When she threw bowls at him and rushed to tear at his clothes, he attributed it to her illness and forgave her. He would silently leave the house. But when she sat there nagging and meticulously scraping at his nerves, he saw a wicked and ugly devil inside her. A chill would instantly run down his spine. But that didn't mean he had ever formed a vicious resolve to harm his sister. If he had merely hated her, it would have ended simply. The fact that he dragged it out this long, despite cursing her, surely means there must be another reason behind it. Behind her back, the village people pointed fingers at her. Why does a young woman act so wildly? Isn't she crazy? That's why. I've never seen such a crazy bitch. After a commotion broke out in the village over a well bucket once, they firmly believed she was crazy. She had just drawn a bucket of water, but her bucket was nowhere to be found. The water tub was clearly in the yard, so she wondered what happened. She went to the well outside the gate, but it wasn't there either. She couldn't help but think that a woman who came to draw water had stolen it, figuring it was left by the well. Because people frequented the well day and night, and buckets were often lost. She immediately went out the gate, heading toward the well, and screamed, "Which bitch took my bucket?" She then made a slip of the tongue, screaming, "Does this village only have thieves, taking other people's things?" She was the kind of person who blurted out whatever came to mind when she was angry. The women gathered by the well were of course furious. "Hey lady, what kind of talk is that?" scolded one. "Who said we took it? Village bitches?" charged another. And another attacked, yelling, "This village only has thieves? Are you not a bitch from this village too?" Like this, a fierce quarrel went back and forth for half the day, and the village was so noisy it seemed it would blow away. If Myung-ryol hadn't come out that day and apologized profusely, she would have certainly faced a terrible ordeal. It turned out later that the bucket was sitting clear, only on top of the water jar in the kitchen. Even after that, she did not hesitate to come out to the village and throw tantrums multiple times. Whenever this happened, the quiet brother would make an unintelligible sound from his room. Caught between a moan and resistance. However, looking only at this, one cannot simply view the sister as an evil woman. Myung-ryol once thought that he felt sorry for just eating the food his sister barely managed to earn. However, no matter how hard he looked, there was no suitable job. Looking for anything to do, a thought suddenly came to him, and he reassured his sister. "Sister, I will try delivering newspapers starting tomorrow. If we earn together, it will be better than now, so don't worry." At this, his sister jumped up and stopped him. "Don't say such things. What is a newspaper delivery? It might be different if your body was strong, but can you do such a thing?" "Why couldn't I? I just have to run once a day." "Even so, you can't. There are certain people meant for that, she said with a displeased face, comforting her brother instead. Just stay put quietly and eat the food I give you. That will be more of a blessing to me than you earning money for us. Things will somehow work out later. And less than 3 hours after this, she accidentally bumped her head hard on the doorframe, cried out, "Ouch!" and then the illness started again. Why do I suffer like this? To feed that cripple lying there lazily? Hurry up and scrape my bones and eat them, you bastard. Then, when Myung-ryol, harboring deep malice toward his sister, tried to leave to do manual labor in Osaka, Japan, the one who obstinately held him back and stopped him was ultimately his sister. Not only did she stop him, she wept bitterly. Are you leaving because I was a bit harsh? You know perfectly well my temper is ruined. How could you take it so seriously? Complaining that she couldn't control her own temper, she stopped the departing man, wiping her eyes. I'll feel too empty to live without you. Even if it's a bit hard, let's stay together. I'll figure out a way for us to live later. Seeing this, one might think Myung-ryol lacks decisiveness. But he had an agony far greater than the issue of decisiveness. Seeing that he resisted leaving but eventually collapsed in tears himself shows this. At times like this, he felt as if he was finally seeing his sister in her true light, and he felt endlessly ashamed of himself for harboring malice toward the sister he owed his life to. If he abandoned his mentally unwell sister and left, who would look after her? He revised his thoughts, deciding that no matter what happens, he must not leave his sister. So to speak, he was a peculiar younger brother who harbored both a grudge and a sense of gratitude toward his sister. I had truly never seen a sister like this. She would torment her brother to no end, but then, if her mood changed somehow, wouldn't she smile broadly? And saying she felt sorry for her brother growing up without parents, she would buy meat to cook for him and bring him noodles mixed with sauce to eat. But whatever the case, that's fine. It's enough for me to just recount the results that occurred there. On a drizzling day, his sister asked me to buy just one water bucket for her. The house had a bucket, but it had been used for so long that the bottom had rotted away. To draw well water, a new bucket was absolutely necessary. Of course, she could have gone herself, but she thought a man going would be less likely to be cheated in haggling than a woman. I took an umbrella and went out onto the street. However, no matter how much I searched the neighborhood, there was no hardware store. I had to go all the way down to Jongno to buy a bucket. When I handed her the change, I said, there weren't really any good buckets. You bought it well. It's sturdy and nice, she said, thoroughly satisfied as she inspected the bucket inside. And then, looking at me pitifully for having gone out in the rain, she said, your shoes are all wet. What should we do? She was very thankful and asked, how much did you pay for this? I paid 45 Jon. Oh, it's very cheap. If we went, we'd have to pay 60 Jon. She was very pleased, as if she had hit a great windfall. Strangely, however, as she stared at the bucket for a while, her face gradually changed. Wrinkles gathered around her eyes, and as it happened, whenever her illness started, foam gathered at her lips. She slammed the bucket down onto the ground with a thud, grabbed the hair of Sony, who was sitting on the edge of the wooden porch, and yelled, "You bitch!" Sony was merely sitting there after eating lunch and naturally had no fault at all. After slapping the girl's cheeks a few times, she scolded her absurdly, "You bitch! When you eat, sit properly and eat. What kind of behavior is that for a girl?" I inexplicably felt anxious, and my face grew hot. Looking closely, there was one dented spot on the side of the bucket. That didn't sit well with her. Of course, if she had just told me, I, ignorant as I am, would have quickly gone to exchange it for her. However, she was not the type of person to openly and clearly state her complaints to others. To needlessly beat the child and subtly make me feel uneasy was far more refreshing for her. I had no intention of stopping this, nor did I feel right standing there watching. Standing awkwardly, I had no choice but to retreat into the opposite room. Myung-ryol was still lying in his sickbed with an unwell body. The noisy crying outside made his already gloomy face grimace even more. Then he made a booming sound. Hard to distinguish whether it was a groan or a protest. To tell the truth, nothing was more painful to him than when Sony was beaten by his sister. Rain or shine, Sony was always attached to a reason to be beaten. At the sound of her sister's voice, she would freeze like a mouse that met a cat. Suppressed like this, the 12-year-old girl literally had yellow flowers blooming on her face. Nongryol sat up as if he was going to do something drastic, but then just remained silent. He seemed to be thinking. He grabbed his head with one hand, thinking about something for a long while. Finally, he reached under his blanket, pulled something out, and placed it before me. With a face full of despair, he said, "I wonder what this means." "What is it?" I was startled and bewildered. It was the letter that had gone to Myung-ju and returned with a "delivery refused" tag attached. Judging by the postmark, it was clear he had mailed it yesterday morning and received it back today. Since I hadn't visited for a few days, it was obvious such a disaster had occurred. He kept his head bowed, then looked up at me again. "What does this mean? There's no way someone who even wrote a reply wouldn't accept it." "I wonder." I was at a loss for how to answer. Helplessly, I bowed my head with him and just stayed silent. Then, suddenly remembering a story about Giseng houses I had read in a magazine a long time ago, I nodded my head as if I had finally realized, saying, "Ah, it must be like this." I leaned closer to him and said, "The mothers of Gisengs are very wicked. They always keep guard for fear their daughters might fall in love and cause trouble. So would she be able to write a letter? It means the mother is intercepting the letters, refusing to accept them, and sending them back again and again." Since he seemed to realize and went, "Ah," I added, "that's why, if you want to send a letter, the only way is to secretly deliver it directly to the person involved," making up a plausible excuse. After I said this much, he asked no more. He seemed to accept it as it was and regretted sending the letter by mail. Seeing this, I too couldn't help but feel relieved. Because he would just send letters through me, and if he didn't see a reply, that would be it. He didn't expect anything else from her. Since there was not the slightest worry he would actually go seek out Myung-ju himself, I believed it was fine. Late that night, Myung-ryol came to visit me. As he was an unexpected guest, I looked at him somewhat doubtfully, but anyway, I welcomed him into the room first, unable to suppress my curiosity. "What brings you here in the middle of the night?" He gave no answer. He just sat there with a calm, heavy face, only smoking a cigarette. When he finally opened his mouth, he asked, "Could you let me sleep here today?" "Sure," I readily agreed, but wondered what he meant. Judging by his clothes, a winter jacket and ankle bands, I didn't ask anything and just let it be. He was the kind of person who would scowl if others asked about his family affairs.